Yeah, okay, so we've got a couple of people in the room, and then so the people who are in the room, we have a little icebreaker Mentimeter. If you have a device, a phone or a laptop, if you go to mentimeter.com, I'm actually going to just paste the number in the chat just now. It's just so we understand who you are, but if you're able, you can also speak out, but I'll just pop this in the chat. And then you've got the link to the Mentimeter.
And I just want to double check that this is going to show up. You're putting this in the Zoom chat.
I'm putting it in the chat for the room. I don't know whether people in the room would see the chat actually in the physical room. Will they see that?
They cannot. We have to manually tell them.
Okay, so you go to a website called mentimeter.com. That's Mentimeter. You're going to see it on the slide in a moment, so you'll be able to hopefully read it as well. And the code that you enter is 38394123. I'm also going to paste a link to some collaborative notes. So if anyone in the room or online wants to add to the collaborative notes, you can find those on the RDA webpage. So the webpage for this specific session, you'll be able to find them there if you go to that on the internet, but you'll also see the link to that in the slides. So I think we're good to go.
Yep.
So I'm going to just share my screen.
저 현장에 계신 분들 지금 발표자분께서 멘티미터라고 화면에 지금 보이는 주소로 들어가신 다음에 그 밑에 있는 인증번호를 입력하시면 아이스 브레이킹 같은 거 하신다고 하시거든요. 그러니까 들어가셔서 확인하시면 될 것 같아요. 스펠링은 mentimeter.com입니다.
Excellent. Okay, I think you've got the information from that slide. So I'll just begin with the presentation.
Would you mind setting it on full mode? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Never mind.
You see it on full mode now? Yeah.
Can you turn
Perfect.
to the Mentimeter slide for a minute?
Yeah, 1 second. I'll just go through so you get the information on. Oh, I went too far.
Too far.
Oh, where was it? There you go.
There. Yeah.
화면에 보이시는 주소로 들어가셔서 인증번호 입력하시면 된다 하십니다.
And Sarah, in Mentimeter, it looks like you're driving where the next slide gets displayed, but we should probably give people a minute to answer the first question.
Yeah, 1 second. Let me just come out of the slideshow for that, and I'm going to just set this to audience pace, and then people can jump to the next question as they like.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, excellent. And what I'll do, I'll just give a brief introduction first, and then we'll get to the Mentimeter in a minute, but by all means, have a start looking at the Mentimeter if you would like to. Oh yeah, and Ming Fang is also mentioned in the chat. You can also go to menti.com rather than Mentimeter. I think it takes you to exactly the same place. Or maybe you need to go to menti.com. Maybe I made an error on the slide there. Work in progress. I'm actually going to just come out of that slideshow and just change that because I think
they both work. They both work,
do they?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So we're a few minutes past the hour, so perfect time to start. Give people a chance to come in a little bit after. So I'm Sarah Jones. I work at Géant, which is essentially the internet, the network provider for higher education in Europe. And I'm one of the co-chairs of the GORC interest group. We have an interest group which looks at the kind of overarching needs for the global open research commons. And we also have a working group, and we're going to present some information from both of those. And the other person who's here moderating today is Andrew Treville. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Andrew Schuller. I'm one of the other co-chairs of the GORC, Global Open Research Commons Interest Group, and I work for an organisation in Australia called the Australian Research Data Commons.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Andrew. So there are several co-chairs of this group. We had an earlier session, so you can by all means look at that recording as well. Karen Payne, who coordinates the working group, ran that with Mark Leggett, and we have two other chairs rather, Xavier from the European Commission and Devika, who's working in India. So you'll know from the other sessions, no doubt, that sessions are all being recorded. So if you miss it or your colleagues miss it and you want to pass that on, by all means, point them to the recording. And if there's anything you don't catch or understand, you can go back to it. You can also interject with questions at any point, either raise a hand or put things in the chat, and we'll pick up on that. What we're going to do today is a little bit of a welcome, and we have an icebreaker, which is why we've been mentioning the Mentimeter. And then I'm going to give an introduction to the previous work, what's happened at previous plenaries, and a review from the interest group and the work we've been doing there. There have also been 2 BO5 sessions at RDA this year that are highly relevant to our work. So we'll speak about those. And then we're going to speak about what we call the speaker series in the working group. Within the working group, we've been trying to understand what's happening in different commons initiatives. So I am involved in the European Open Science Cloud, which is essentially trying to federate the data infrastructure in Europe. And Andrew works in a parallel initiative in Australia called the Australian Research Data Commons. So they're 2 examples. And we're going to give some information that's been presented in the speaker series on those. And that's really trying to see what the commonalities are across the work we're doing, either in different national contexts or different regions, or it could also be thematic. We had a presentation from Francois Geneva, for example, on the International Virtual Observatory. And once we've gone through those examples, we're going to lead into an interactive discussion. So the first thing is just to try and understand who you are, what you want from the session, whether you're in Seoul, you might have some tips on things in Seoul. So we have a short icebreaker, which is just 5 questions. So if you go to menti.com and you enter this code, you should be able to answer the questions. So I'm going to come out of the slide share here and jump to the Mentimeter page and put to present on that. So we wanted to understand where people are. Wow, most people are in Asia and Australia. I'm in Europe. I should have actually opened this up on my phone so I can answer as well. But I'll give this a minute so anyone else can answer. It's nice to see that we have people from Asia and Australia, because often in these sessions at RDA, we don't have the geographic spread. We have people from North America as well, which is also good. And I know at the plenary, we've got people from Africa and Latin America too. There was Bianca from Latin America presenting in a plenary session yesterday. So nice to see we've got people from all around the world. I'll go to the next question. Let me see how I advance. Here we go. So the coolest thing in Seoul, Namdaeum, I don't know what that is, if that's a city or if it's a particular palace or site. I haven't been there since
one of the markets.
Sorry?
One of the markets.
Ah, cool. Okay. The food was actually what I was going to answer. I came to Seoul a few years ago, actually, to do some consultancy with Kisti. And I loved the street market. So it was fantastic getting all of the food from there. The cultural palaces, the awesome night view, great food, coexistence of traditional and modern buildings and culture. Yeah, I think Seoul's a very exciting city. So those of you who are there in person, I hope you're enjoying time exploring as well as coming to the sessions. And then have you been to a GORC session before? So some people have, some people think they have, they can't remember. There are lots of things that are similar. GORC, there's also a GOSC initiative that CoData runs. And as we mentioned, there's been a couple of BO5, so there's kind of similar sessions to this. We also have some newbies in the room. So yeah, by all means, ask questions if anything's unclear as we go through. Luckily, nobody is in the wrong room, but if you do find that this isn't what you expected as we go through, by all means, jump off to another session. We won't take offense. And what are you hoping to get from this? So information from the community about what you want us to do next. I think that's a good one. We're certainly looking for inputs, other people in the speaker series, and also feedback on the work we've done, whether it is right from your perspective, if it's the type of content you need. We will be giving you an update on the group's activities. And yes, good that you're hoping to learn heaps. We will obviously present initially, and then there'll be time for discussion, so we can hopefully help you understand more about the Open Research Commons. And the last one, what's your experience of RDA in one word? Oh, sad. Oh God, hopefully that wasn't too bad an experience. Hopefully we can make that better for you.
Sorry, Sarah, that was me. Sad because I can't be there in person.
Ah, okay. So there's a reason to be sad. I'm actually sad not to be there in person as well. But to be honest, I had a big conference last week, so it's probably good. Otherwise, I'd be totally jet lagged and not really able to contribute. Looking for information, they're finding it insightful and interesting. Yeah, it's a very broad topic coverage at RDA. It's unbelievable how many interest groups and working groups there are. There's so much rich information. I actually passed on details of RDA to one of my Géant colleagues the other day, and he said I'd opened a whole new world for him because he didn't realize how much there was going on. And I think that's true. When people come to a plenary as a newbie, it can be very overwhelming. It's such a big community and there's so much work going on. It's certainly very cooperative as well. RDA is a kind of ground up organization. The members are what drives RDA. So it's a very kind of contributory experience to be part of that community. And it is also very supportive. We are quite friendly people. So make sure you make contacts over the coffee breaks and find your data people, you know, people who are working in the same field, same area as you, because they can help you address your challenges. So nice, positive comments there. So I'm glad you're all having a good RDA. And that was the end of the icebreaker. So I'll just come out of that screen and come back to the slides. I haven't been monitoring the chat, but I think Andrew's just letting everyone know about the collaborative notes. So do add your names into that, and then we know who's in the session and who would like more information. Okay, so an introduction to the meeting and previous work. We've been running this group for a few years now, and we've presented at previous plenaries. What we learned at Plenary 18, when we presented on the working group, was that we should use a number of different ways to try and categorize the commons. So we're looking at, you know, what type of infrastructure, e-infrastructure is in place, the geographic region for the commons, so like European in my context, or Australia for Andrew. Sometimes commons initiatives are also led by domain. You might have a health data space, for example. And we've also been using a typology that we've developed in the interest group as a way to try and categorize and understand the commons and to see how people are really kind of working in different areas. And these elements have been used as the beginnings of a set of tags in this library of resources we've been collecting. So on Zotero, you can see this library, and it's kind of grouped and tagged by these different categories. We've also been recruiting speakers from members of the working group, but also outside of the working group, to describe the different commons initiatives they're involved in. And we've done that through a speaker series. There's a presentation every month. As I mentioned, some of these are thematic. So we heard from Francoise on the virtual observatory in astronomy. We've also heard from Kazu from NII in Japan about the work they're doing, and then about initiatives like EOSC and ARDC as well. And that speaker series is something we're going to pick up on and present some information from. When we've asked anybody to speak, we've presented them with a common list of questions and categories so that they're able to try and describe their work in a coherent way, so that we can then map across what's happening in each geographic area or each domain. And that's how we're trying to essentially understand the space, see where things are advanced, see where there's gaps, and to see where we can learn lessons from parallel initiatives. So this is the typology that we developed in the interest group. And these white boxes kind of represent the overarching governance or policy aspects that need to be in place to operate a commons initiative. So you need some form of governance, some boards that kind of steer the work. You need to obviously be engaging with the community, with the different service providers or infrastructure, as well as the researchers and the end users. You need some kind of rules of participation. Who can use the commons? Are there any charges for the services, for example? How do you ensure the quality of the data and the services? You need the support, the human capacity, the kind of training and user support. And you need to make sure things are sustainable, because if somebody is accessing data and services, they want to know that they can rely on those. So these are the kind of governance and policy layers. But then we also need the actual technical building blocks. So we need all of the different, from the network layer to the storage and compute that sits upon that. We also need all of the different services and tools. So researchers can pull together the different content, they can process their data, they have access to the relevant software. And in order to make those things work together, we need to think about the interoperability and standards. So how do we map across different metadata schema from different disciplines? How do we make sure that the AAI, so researchers can log in, actually is seamless across the different services? So the interoperability, we've made this a dark blue because this is really the glue that holds everything together. It links to the policy layer, and it also is what makes all the technology come together. And then the other key component is obviously the research objects. There's no point in operating a commons if there's no content for people to work on. So these are the elements that we defined. And what we've done is we've tried to actually describe what each of those elements means. So at the moment, we're working on a series of definitions based on that typology. And you can see those in a Google Doc that Andrew will hopefully paste in the chat. It's very much a working document. So please do look at the definitions and let us know whether they work or not and suggest improvements to them. This is something we're hoping to finalize in the next few months, so we can have the diagram and a set of definitions that are then the kind of working basis on how we describe and operate the commons.
Karen, I wonder whether there might be, before we do that slide, I wonder if anyone has any comments or questions on the diagram. There was quite a lot of interest in that typology in the other groups that I've been in so far. So I'm wondering whether, before we move on, whether anyone had any comments or questions about that.
Yeah, certainly. Did somebody speak up then?
I coughed.
Oh, okay. So if anyone wants to raise a hand, obviously we can see the hands and bring you in, but you're also welcome to just shout out. So the people who are in the room in Seoul, there is a roving microphone, so by all means use that if you want to contribute. There is, I mean, I think we've captured most of the elements, but if there's something missing, let us know. And also, if you think any of these terms are confusing, so rules of participation, for example, this is a term we use in the EOS context, and we couldn't think of a better term, but it may not be something that's kind of self-explanatory. So there may be things in this diagram where you think, no, that's the wrong word, or human capacity. Maybe you don't associate that with the kind of the support and training. So let us know if you think the terminology could be improved, or also the way we've visualized it. We've tried to use the different color coding and the way we've combined these kind of honeycomb structure to represent how things interact. But we wanted to avoid a model where it was too hierarchical, you know, like a layer stack. And we also wanted to avoid too many arrows between things, because everything connects in different ways. So yeah, so let us know if that works for you or not. And you can also do that in the collaborative notes if it takes a little bit of time to pass your thoughts. You can come back with comments at any point. Okay, so as I mentioned at the opening, there have been 2 other BOFs run at this plenary, which are very related to the work we're doing here. And I'll give a brief introduction and then I'll let Andrew speak, because Andrew's actually attended both of these BOFs. There was one on data commons principles and implementation. So again, we call ours the Open Research Commons, but data commons is a kind of parallel term. And what they wanted to do in this group is look at the high level aspirational goals. What are people trying to achieve when they're setting up or running a data commons? And to map those high level principles to the best practices and implementation. How are different people doing this work? What standards are they using? What kind of mechanisms are they using for things like user engagement, and what's working well? And through that, they want to essentially try and build a community so that people are sharing those good practices. And then the other BOF was on developing a taxonomy for the research data spaces. Now, this term data spaces comes very much from the European context. Within the European Commission, they have funded work on EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, but they also have 9 disciplinary data spaces. So there's a health data space, an agricultural data space, a manufacturing data space. And the idea is that each thematic area essentially operates a commons where all of the data and services for that kind of research area is shared. And then those data spaces connect. So EOSC is seen as a horizontal. It addresses all disciplines and domains, and that's seen as a way to kind of connect up all of these data spaces. So this data space BOF is trying to essentially establish a taxonomy and definition of terms relevant to the data spaces. And as I mentioned, these are thematic, and they cut across different geographic spaces. So they're not national level infrastructures. It's not a kind of, you know, Swedish data service. It's something that's broader than that. So Andrew, do you want to give reflections on what was discussed in those BOFs?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So as Sarah, let me start with the data spaces one first, because that's the one that Sarah's just been talking about, and then I'll move on to the data commons. So I think Sarah has characterized the data spaces very well. They very much have a European flavor. They, as an outsider, someone from outside Europe, it feels to me like the data space activity is going on almost in parallel with, or almost orthogonal to, the work on the European Open Science Cloud. I keep getting told, no, they're connected, but it doesn't look like that to me. Sarah can explain to me why I'm wrong, because EOSC is very complicated. Data spaces are very complicated. The intersection between the two of them is multiplicatively complicated. So it was a BOF, it was a birds of a feather session. So for those of you that have not seen this term, this was a group of people getting together really just to talk about an idea. And sometimes that's all it is. You have a BOF, it meets, people exchange information, and it doesn't go any further. This was one where we had lots of information from different perspectives on what data spaces might mean, I presented the work that we've done in the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group. And where we ended up was that there were lots of related topics that were being talked about, but where the definitions were not clear. A number of people found that that hexagon diagram that Sarah showed before a helpful way of thinking about it, although a number of people also made the point that even within each one of those hexagons, there's a lot of work to be done. Sustainability, I think, was the example that was highlighted. Just expanding out all the things that you might say about sustainability is huge, and that's just part of it. So where the group ended up was that they would try and continue the data space discussions. They would try and expand it out from a very European audience to something more global. They would have a discussion with this group, the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group, to see how we might align with it. But no clear next steps other than, yes, this is an interesting idea and we should try and continue it. So it's not clear to me whether that group will turn into a working group or whether it will stay just a discussion between a number of participants. So that's the BOF on research data spaces taxonomy. The other BOF that I attended earlier today, at least earlier today, my time, and also Korean time as it turns out, was the Data Commons Principles. So this was a BOF pulled together by Dawei Lin from the National Institutes of Health in the United States. As it turns out, the National Institutes of Health was one of the inspirations for the Global Open Research Commons model, that hexagon diagram, although it's moved on a long way from what the NIH was doing. But some of their ideas were helpful for us. And that group had a series of presentations that had very different flavors. So we had a presentation from work done in the health space by a guy called Bob Grossman, talking about some technology that they've developed called Gen 3. And that was essentially looking at very discipline-focused data commons. So things that were for cancer genomics or environment or precision oncology. So these were things that were specific to a relatively small number of researchers. And he had some very nice lessons on how you might build those more focused data commons. We then had a presentation from Jill Barnholtz-Sloan talking about a much larger cancer data commons, also from the United States, which was including a whole range of different kinds of data. So this is, if you like, one level up from the kind of commons that Bob Grossman was talking about, but again, specific to a particular research domain. And then we had a much more, I guess, theoretical presentation, I would call it, from Wim Hugo. Wim Hugo is the Chief Technical Officer at the Data Archiving and Networking Services Group in The Hague. So they're the Dutch National Centre of Expertise in research data, and they have a very elegant conceptual model for how you would think about building a commons, which consists of a number of actors and relationships between them. I'm still processing that and thinking through how to map that onto the way I see the world. But he also talked about a number of projects that they're using or that they're developing as test beds for that conceptual model. One is a thing called FAIR-Core for EOSC, which is one of the 658,000 different EOSC-related projects, which I can't keep straight in my head, but Sarah, I'm sure can. And also another project called FAIR Impact. So this is them trying to take that conceptual model and translate it into an actual project. Where the discussion at the end of that BOF agreed that they would like to take that work forward in the context of the Global Open Research Commons. And it's listed on the agenda for the next meeting of the chairs of this group. So we'll be talking more about that. One of the attendees, Mark Parsons, asked a really interesting question, which is, once I showed the hexagon diagram, he said, okay, great, who's the audience for that? Which is a question that I hadn't actually thought through, and I'm thinking through at the moment. Clearly a question we need to answer. So that one, I think, probably will potentially turn into a working group as part of this interest group, but we need to have the conversation. I guess my takeaway from both of those BOFs is that there's a lot of stuff happening around the world, and we're all talking about similar kinds of things in slightly different language. Some of you may have heard presentations already at this event about the Global Open Science Cloud, GOSC, not GORC, which is also tackling some of this. And I think the challenge for all of us is to join this activity together so that we're not duplicating work, but rather we're coordinating and complementing what we do.
Yeah, I think that's very important. You're right. There's a lot of kind of parallel initiatives trying to understand this space, and using different terminology, which can make them seem different initiatives, but they're really not. And I think that's a good reason for these RDA groups to try and coordinate. So it's good that we've been able to connect with these BOFs and to try and join up the conversations. And it's great to hear that they're doing some more practical implementation work, for example, with those fair impact and fair core for EOSC. Because I think one of the things, maybe a reflection from me on Mark's question about who's that diagram for, I think we necessarily kept it quite high level so that you can communicate with all people, policymakers, funders, but really, ultimately, that model should be helpful for the people implementing. And the only way that's going to be really useful is if we can drill down, we can have the simple model, then we can go to some basic definitions, but then actually look at what are the ways you implement each of these elements. And hopefully some of those other initiatives can help us really build that essentially like layers of information. So then you can drill down to the relevant point based on who you are.
Yeah, look, completely agree, Sarah. Can you just go back 2 slides, just back to that diagram?
Yeah, of course.
Just picking up on the comment that Sarah just made, I completely agree with it. I think one of the advantages of the way, sorry, I'm biased because I helped shape the diagram, but I think one of the advantages of the diagram as it's written is that it doesn't just focus on the technical stuff, the sort of the blue stuff down the bottom. It really does emphasize that you need all of that other stuff at the top. And quite often you'll see people implementing solutions that over focus on the bottom 3 and don't spend enough time worrying about the 5 at the top. And yet if you don't get the 5 at the top right, you're ultimately doomed to failure. So I think, yes, Sarah, completely agree. As an implementation or design pattern, this reminds you that you need to think about all of those other things as well.
Yeah, and actually maybe just a reflection from the EOS context there. I mean, the European Commission has been kind of getting all of the agreements in place with the member states to make investments in EOS from very early on, from about 2015. But then it started funding projects. So a lot of the work happened on these blue boxes in different projects that were kind of working in silos, so it wasn't coordinated. And there wasn't this overarching governance and rules of participation. So we very much put the cart before the horse. We had lots of things building without too much user engagement, without thinking about the sustainability. Who's ultimately responsible for this? How are we going to continue from one project to the next? And without having some kind of board or governance or the rules of engagement. And in terms of the governance we put in place, there was initially an expert group the European Commission convened in 2018, which was after a lot of the implementation had started. And that group ran for 2 years. And an outcome of that was setting up a legal entity, which is the EOSC Association. And that's now a membership organization which has members from research funders, from universities, from different service providers or commercial parties. And that's essentially the voice of the community. So that's now the way that we're trying to get everybody's inputs, get the consensus, and have the association has a board of directors. I'm one of those directors. And that's the way we're trying to help steer and have that oversight. But it's very difficult. It's kind of difficult to start with that. But if that's missing for too long, the implementation can go wrong or cannot be as effective as it could be. So it's definitely important to have these two elements and ideally to develop them in parallel. I think that's one of the key lessons we've learned in the European context, because it's quite hard to shift things when there's already been a lot that's built. You know, obviously people have made a lot of investment and time and effort in that. So it's quite hard to then change things if it's not working. Okay, so with that note, I will move on to speak about EOSC, and then Andrew will mention ARDC, and we can use these as two examples to feed into the discussion. So EOSC is the European Open Science Cloud, and it's a kind of common joke that all of these terms are wrong, that, you know, we're not only thinking about Europe, it's not only open data, it's all types of data. It's not really science, it's research. Science can be a term that can alienate a lot of communities, and absolutely is not a cloud. So this is not just about cloud infrastructure and computing. The aim is to federate all the different research infrastructures across Europe. We do have a shiny new logo, which came out of a competition. It's not that shiny, but we have a new logo. We had a competition through the EOSC Association where we asked students across Europe from design schools to submit, and this was the logo that was picked by the members. And so this is the new visual identity for EOSC. And that part of that is to try and help have a bit more clarity across the projects. So there'll be like variants of that for the different projects, like Fair Core for EOSC and Fair Impact. So in terms of the context, these slides are based on the presentation given by Michel Sculper when he spoke in the speaker series. EOSC essentially is a data space, one of these horizontal data spaces that should be connecting with all of the sector data spaces. Andrew reflected that it's a very complex landscape. It definitely is. EOSC has been kind of like being built and worked on for several years. The data spaces are completely new. So there's obviously been a lot of work about infrastructure in health and agriculture, but that hasn't been coordinated at the European level. So the data spaces are very much in those initial phases of starting discussion. There isn't anything tangible to say, this is the health data space. And that's part of the problem on connecting EOSC and the data spaces, that it's so new, people haven't really even conceived their ideas, let alone started to have some working documents or infrastructure for us to connect to. In terms of the ecosystem approach for EOSC, there's 4 strands. We've got the open science policy and incentives. Most of the research funders across Europe have some kind of open science policy, and obviously the European Commission does too. There's lots of legislation in Europe to require this, and also guidelines from the likes of UNESCO. So there's a very strong policy drive. And within those policies, they often reference FAIR. And people talk about making sure data is managed in a fair way so that it's accessible and interoperable and reusable. In terms of the way we describe EOS, we talk about federation. So it's not a kind of single repository or platform. It's not like one big thing. We know there's lots of research infrastructures in different communities, in different countries. There's lots of services through universities. And what we're trying to do is define a set of common standards to link those up so that there's a federation and across all of these different infrastructures. And engagement with the community is a very key thing for us. The challenge for Europe is that it's huge, lots of countries, lots of languages, lots of different cultures, and lots of stakeholders. So funders in every country. You've got the member states. Just the way the European landscape is set up, it's very complicated in terms of making any decision on anything. And EOSC is no different there. There's lots of players that you need to get on side and get collaborating. So the goal of EOSC is to bring things together under one umbrella. Now, that's not centralizing infrastructure, it's about federating. And there are a series of infrastructures the European Commission's funded. So GEON, where I work, is essentially the pan-European network. So we work with members in every country to operate the internet and trust and identity services so that users can log on and access services, and they have high speed, high throughput internet connection. There's also data management services. So for example, UDAT is an initiative that had services for file sync and share, storage, data transfer when you're trying to move huge quantities of data to the processing, for example. EGI does cloud computing. We also have a group called PRACE that does supercomputing, and there's a parallel initiative to EOSC called Euro HPC, where essentially we're linking up all the high performance computing so that there's European access to that. And then we also have groups that are working more in the open access space, like OpenAIRE, and dealing with research outputs, how we describe those outputs, how we make sure that they're properly identified, and having this kind of research graph mentality so that all the outputs are linked. From the publication, you can access the data, you can look at who the researchers are and see the networks. So we're trying to bring together all of this, what we would term e-infrastructure in the European context. And this is essentially the cross-cutting horizontal underlying services. And then we also have all of the national and institutional infrastructures. So we have things like the Large Hadron Collider, we have research infrastructures in different thematic areas, and we want to bring those together. We merge the e-infrastructures and the research infrastructures so that we have this essentially EOSC environment or ecosystem or platform. And all of these kind of research infrastructures are much more tailored to the specific needs of a given community. So they use domain-specific metadata standards. They all have different practices in terms of when data is made open, how it's licensed, based on the way that that community operates. And that can make interoperability challenging because everybody has different needs. There's not a one-size-fits-all. Now, just to try and explain those visuals to try and explain those concepts rather, the EOSC core is the e-infrastructures I've just mentioned. So, the likes of the network. And then we're trying to federate the data. So to pull together access to the data from different services. That doesn't mean putting it in one repository. The data will reside wherever it lives, but we have like a common access to that data. So a single search and an ability for people to find things regardless of where they are. And then we have what we call the exchange layer, which is more where you have competitive services. So there are various different ways you could store data. There are different services you'll use for processing, and this is really where researchers have a choice. And then this other diagram, this shows the 5 clusters in the European context. So there's lots of individual research infrastructures dealing with different areas of research, or sometimes working at a national level. And these have been grouped into clusters. So EmbryFair deals with everything in the environmental sciences. EOSC Life deals with everything in the health sciences. SHOC is the social science and humanities cluster. And these clusters are collaborating in a project called EOSC Future. We have all the e-infrastructures and the 5 cluster projects. And that's the main investment in EOSC to try and essentially build the core services. So EOSC is trying to mediate access to the existing infrastructure. That's what we mean by federation. And potentially that makes us different to other commons, because I think other commons are maybe being built on a national level. So it's less about the federation, it's more about, setting something up. We're also focusing on materials throughout the life cycle. It's not just data, it's also publications, it's also research workflows, the code that people are developing to do their research. So it's all types of output. And we're creating a kind of minimum quality framework. So one of the priorities in EOSC at the moment is developing data quality indicators, because people need to be reassured that, the content is appropriate. And in terms of federating the services, this is challenging in lots of ways. With VC is actually going to be doing a public procurement for the EOS core. There's been work that's gone on for this already. But as I mentioned before, lots of work is happening in projects, and that's not really the best way to operate services. So they're actually putting out a procurement at the moment to develop the services and to ensure that the IP is held by the Commission, and hopefully they'll transfer that to EOSC Association, which is the governance, and then we can work with a service provider to operate the core platform. And we're also, a key thing within EOSC is the interoperability framework, which is a set of standards to ensure that, either the metadata or the AAI is coherent across the different service providers. And that's essentially how somebody federates into EOSC. They map their practice to this common kind of benchmark of the standards they need to conform to. EOSC is also very community developed. So when we've been working on things like the interoperability framework, we're looking at what standards people are implementing in different contexts and thinking about how we crosswalk from those to a kind of common standard. So we're working very much with the community to define these things. So the vision for EOSC, we do have a catalogue of services, but that's not sufficient. We need to move beyond that catalogue to develop all the different components so it's easy for people to integrate what they need. And the idea is that we'll grow to this level of kind of having service packages. So a researcher can come to EOSC, they have their institutional logon or their kind of research domain logon that enables them to access a broader range of services than they would have been able to before, and a broader range of data. And they're able to essentially, in a working environment, combine what they need, their data with a lab notebook, with sufficient kind of storage and processing power to do their work. So we want to essentially enable them to pull things from different places to be able to do their research. And eventually there will be some kind of interface that lets researchers combine all these different elements. The VREs or gateways could help to achieve this vision, and the procurement of the EOS core is the way that we're essentially hoping to have that basic environment in place. We also, through the EOSC Association, we've been developing a strategic research and innovation agenda. And that essentially sets out the framework of what still needs to be done. So the SRIA has a whole strategy element. So there's 3 goals around the challenges for the people elements, the different stakeholders, the data and the infrastructure. And within that, we have action areas. And those action areas, there are some that are very much about the technical building blocks. And there's also some that are very much about those governance layers, the rules, the participation, and the kind of social aspects. And there's a roadmap that's developed. These roadmaps kind of based on a 2-year period. We've just released the multi-annual roadmap for the 2023 to 24 period, and there'll be one that carries on following that. So it's very much, it's a long-term initiative, and we just kind of, we look at the work that's been done, how successfully things have been implemented and what the major gaps are for the next phase. So as I mentioned, data quality's come out as a gap currently, and also business models, because if you're wanting to make services available across Europe, sometimes people are funded for one remit. They're a national level service. They're funded to support users in their country, not users from other countries. So we need resourcing models to essentially make it feasible for services to be used across borders. We're also developing within that SRIA a whole set of metrics, and we do quite a lot of monitoring to see where we're at and what the different member state contributions have been. And the EOSC Association has also set up a series of task forces, which are kind of like the RDA working groups and interest groups. It's a way to get the community in, the people who have the expertise on persistent identifiers or FAIR metrics or semantic interoperability, so that the community is driving the implementation. And we definitely collaborate with the Research Data Alliance. We find that's a very useful forum to help us build consensus. So although we're working in the European level, we also look to RDA to essentially check that what we're doing isn't a European silo and that it connects with parallel initiatives internationally. And this GORC group is the way that we do that. And that's all I had to say on EOSC. While we've changed kind of presentation, because Andrew will take over now, I'll just review the chat. And if anyone has a question, by all means, raise a hand or put something in the chat and we can pick up on that. So I'll let Andrew screen share. Michelle's asked, is there a website about the 13 disciplinary data spaces? No, there is not a single website. There is a visual that the European Commission shares with this data lake, which has the data spaces and EOSC on the side as a horizontal. But there isn't like a useful place where you can actually see the whole vision. I'll add that diagram to the chat, and I'll see if I can find some content online about the data spaces. But as with many of these things, there's usually not a simple place where you can actually get a good overview.
Yeah, so Sarah, I managed to find a PDF which looks like it provides the overview that Michelle wants.
Excellent.
I've pasted that in the chat.
The digital strategy. Yeah, excellent. Okay.
Well, it was an overview of the data spaces, which is, I think, what Michelle was specifically
Okay,
wanting.
yeah, the staff working document. This is a type of document the European Commission has to essentially set a roadmap. So staff working documents, they had one on EOSC previously before they set up the EOSC Association. So it's like their first kind of vision statement. And then as these data spaces emerge, there'll hopefully be a coherent kind of web presence where you can find information about them all. But the staff working document is like the first vision and set of principles to then allow them to make the investment.
Yep.
Excellent.
So Sarah has given you an overview of the European Open Science Cloud, which is this very large, complex beast. I would like to give you an overview as a comparative case study of something that is much smaller and focused within a single country, and that's the organization that I work for. This is so we are a national research infrastructure. We have a roadmap. So there was a series of questions that we were asked to respond to, and unlike the slides that Sarah has presented, I don't have a staff of thousands to create slides for me. So what you're going to get is a series of slides which are essentially answers to the questions. So less visually attractive, perhaps. We currently have a roadmap that's being revised. So every 5 years, the Australian government revises its national research infrastructure roadmap. It's done that, and it's now going through the process of updating its national digital research infrastructure strategy. That's going to happen over the course of this year. Probably not going to make a lot of difference to what my organization does. So in the same way, so let me go back one. So in the same way that the European Open Science Cloud is neither European, nor just open, nor just science, nor a cloud, the Australian Research Data Commons is Australian, does focus just on research data, is very much a data thing, although it's increasingly moving into software. But it is a commons. It's confusing. The name of the organization is the Australian Research Data Commons. The thing we are trying to build is also the Australian Research Data Commons.
Sorry to interject, Andrew.
Yep.
There's an issue in chat. People can only see half your slides. I don't know if you want to stop share and try again. I don't know if it's because you're sharing PowerPoint, I don't know, through the app or something, but we're not seeing the full slides.
Okay, what if I do that?
It's not changed yet.
Okay,
Kirsten Elga saying maybe you need to switch it to presentation mode.
It was in presentation mode, unfortunately. I think it's Zoom trying to be helpful.
Sorry, Andrew, but I'm looking from the cell phone, Kirsten here, but I just see your actual working mode, not the presentation mode.
Huh. Okay, let me.
But it's larger now. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Now we see the full screen
sharing
with the sidebar, so we could run with that, but maybe try presentation mode again.
No, what I'll do is I'll share the Google slides rather than the PowerPoint slides, which may mean they're slightly out of date, but I at least know that.
In the meantime, I found that picture of the data spaces in the lake, so I've put that in the chat.
Okay, Kirsten, is that better?
At the moment, it's still black. Just give it 1 second, it might come on. It's not showing that it's loading, so I think it may just be black.
Well, the previous version was okay, but maybe you have two screens and you just have to share.
Yeah, I do have two screens, but
so
hopefully
it looked as if you shared the working mode, but the PowerPoint was fine and we could see the full screen now, but if not, we can deal with the sidebars and the overview, so it's okay.
Okay, so this is not working at all?
Not working at all, no.
All right, well, we will try. So I tested this and it worked fine. All right, one more time. Yeah, it is, in fact, as you say, always the way. Okay, so share. So we're going back to PowerPoint, which is where Zoom, I think, will.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can see the.
We can see the full
with
slide.
The
we just see
on
the
the left-hand
side. Yeah.
Okay, so what if I try? Let me try going into slide share mode. How's that?
It's not changed for us, but we're okay to run with it like that. Hopefully it advances the slides as you go through.
Okay. So you can see enough of the content to make it worth doing?
Yeah, we just see like essentially the whole PowerPoint window. So we see the main slide big, but we also see the menu on the side. But it's fine with the menu. We can run like that if it's.
Yeah, let's hope that the slides are actually going to advance. Zoom is telling me my screen sharing is paused, which is not what I want to see.
If not, I can always share them and you just tell me when to click next.
Okay, how about we do that? I think that's going to be less painful for everybody. Sorry to do this to you, Sarah.
Yeah, no, it's no problem at all. I'm happy to be your glamorous assistant.
The tech support people in Korea are now sitting there saying, see, I told you this was going to happen. They volunteered to advance my slides for me. And I said, no, it'll be fine.
Here we go. So ARDC.
Thank you. Our purpose is to provide Australian researchers with competitive advantage through data. I don't know where the post-it notes came from, but never mind. We're doing this by driving excellence in the creation, analysis, and retention of data assets. We've got strongest engagement with research users. We don't have a lot of engagement with industry users. We've been around as an organisation since 2019, but we're built on 3 organisations that some of which go back to 2009, including the Australian National Data Service, who I used to work for. Next slide, please. We have a service catalogue, and I guess the best way to think about our service catalogue is that we're trying to connect and fill gaps. So we're pulling together resources that other people make available, and we're adding additional things on our own. So we have a research cloud, we have a discovery service called Research Data Australia, we run a series of persistent identifier services, we run a vocabulary service, we have a active program of investment in what we call research digital platforms, what Europe would call VREs, 26 of those at the moment. We support a number of different communities of practice, and we have a large program of engagement with universities and research producing organizations where we provide a variety of different kinds of support. We also try and act as a hub of expertise for Australia across all of those. Next slide, please, Sarah. So one of our questions was, are you a commons or are you a series of commons? And my answer was, we're a single national commons, but we're building out thematic sub-commons. So we have a humanities, arts and social sciences sub-commons. We have a health and medical commons, which is currently being commissioned. And we're in the early planning stages for an ecology agriculture commons. So these are, I guess, a little bit like the thematic data spaces that Europe is putting in place. But Europe's big, Australia's small, we've only got 3. The questions in red are questions that Karen Payne, who is one of our co-chairs, asked after I gave this presentation. I'm not going to go through the questions, but I need to come up with answers to them at some point. Next slide, please. I've already mentioned the 26 platforms that we have available. These are developed, usually developed by organizations outside the ARDC, and a number of them use services that we provide. So they are external activities, but using centrally provided services. And part of what we're doing here through that platforms program is we're looking at what those individual VREs are building, and we're trying to identify opportunities for us to build our own versions of common services, so that rather than everyone having to run up their own version of, let's say, a virtual desktop, we provide a single centralized virtual desktop service that they can call. Next slide, please. We were asked about what standards we support. We essentially support the standards supported by the different domains, the research domains. We do run a national data discovery service, as I've said, based on an obscure international standard that none of you will have heard of, called ISO 2164:2010, which defines, where we've defined our own XML-based metadata schema called RIFCS. We are the only people in the world who care about it, and we're increasingly moving to schema.org as a result. We use ORCIDs for people, and we have a national data site DOI service. I don't know why that's turned into site data. It was definitely data site DOI. In terms of our key priorities, we've got a set of organizational KPIs that we're reviewing. The main way we integrate with other data stores is we harvest metadata from other institutions to create a single catalogue. We engage externally through RDA. We're one of the founding the Australian National Data Service was one of the founding organisations for the Research Data Alliance. We're also involved in a number of the global open science cloud task forces. And I'm on the steering committee for the Research Software Alliance, and the director of the Research Software Alliance, Michelle Barker, is in this meeting. We are actively promoting Core Trust Seal for repositories. And one of the questions was, what do you do about security? And my answer was, we leave that to the people who are managing the data. In terms of governance, we're a company limited by guarantee. We have a board, obviously. We don't have the kind of formal rules of participation that EOSC has. I was involved in the discussions around the rules of participation to make it possible for non-European organizations to take part. And I think the rules of participation are great, but we don't have anything like that ourselves. What else do I want to pick out of that slide? Yeah, we try and work actively at a national policy level. Again, Australia's small, so it's easier to do that. Sorry, small in population terms. So part of our role is advocating for national policies relating to data and to research. And yeah, one of the questions was, how are you incentivizing participation? Do you have organizational norms? I think these are emerging from the work that we're doing at the moment. One of the things we got asked was, where do you put yourself on, well, how do you classify yourself using a checklist called the E-Infra checklist? Sarah, remind me again where the E-Infra checklist came from?
I think out of one of the EOSC projects, because E-Infra is very much like the European way of describing things. And I think Karen had taken an input there and then like tweaked it so we could try and use that as a basis.
Yeah, so yeah, these were quite high level categories, and I think I described us there as scholarly communications subcategory publication, but that's not great because we also do discovery, we also do analysis, we also do outreach. So it's broader than just that, and so I'll need to respond to those questions along those lines. Next slide, please. So you've now heard two examples of different commons initiatives that we are trying to capture through the working group that we have underway. This is a list of the commons that have either presented or have agreed to present. And you can see we've got a range there. We've got what we're calling pan-national activities. And some of you may have heard a presentation from the African Open Science Platform yesterday. We have some examples of domain commons and some examples of, I'm intrigued to see non-European commons as a category, as if Europe is the center of the world. National commons is how I would have perhaps described it. So we've got, if you can go back one, please, Sarah. So, we have examples here from quite actually good representation from Asia, Oceania there, plus the Digital Research Alliance in Canada. Next slide, please. Those are, that list is not the only groups, obviously, and so we have other groups that are on our list that we want to reach out to. Again, examples of pan-national commons, domain, national commons inside Europe, non-European. I'm going to have to talk to Karen about this. This is a terrible way of describing things. And also commercial things. Gaia X, which is oh my goodness, how do I describe Gaia X? An industry-focused HPC initiative in Europe. How do you feel about that, Sarah? Yeah, that'll do.
Yeah,
okay.
It's very much working with industrial players rather than it is addressing research as well, but it's more of a commercial response. It was initially started by the German and French governments, and it's kind of parallel to EOSC, but in comparison to EOSC, it has its own implementation challenges. They're struggling a lot with governance aspects at the moment, so it's slightly stalled.
Okay. And then the Microsoft Planetary Computer, if any of you have seen that as an example of a commercial activity. Next slide. So we have what we're calling a MARTA document. This is obviously a Canadian phrase, which I haven't encountered before. So this is a document essentially where we're pulling together the if you like, the common lessons. Sorry, I'm trying not to make a pun. That was not an intentional pun. we're trying to pull together the lessons that we're abstracting from these different case studies that we've been exposed to. I put in chat the link to that document. This is a live document which will grow over time, and we're trying to identify what are the key takeaways from each of the case studies and abstracting from those. And so part of what we're trying to do is identify the types of functions that each commons provides at a high level, so that we can say, all right, here are the functions that we see across every commons. Here are some that we only see across domain commons. Here are some that we only see across national commons. Really trying to get a sense of how these different national and pan-national approaches and domain approaches map onto this high-level architecture to see if it makes sense. And we've got some questions about some of the consortia that we might want to explore with them. And maybe if we come to, okay, and then so the next steps for this work are Kisti's up next, which is very appropriate given we're in Korea. Sikadi, whose acronym I saw go past, but
yeah, I think it's some Canadian.
Canadian Consortium for Arctic
like
Data
IVOA.
Interoperability. Yep. And then so we've got a bit of a Canadian burst. The Digital Research Alliance of Canada is in September, and then we're going to look at kind of the recap from the meeting today, and also think about document development. And then in November, so we're meeting monthly, as you can see, and then in November we have the Nordic infrastructure collaboration. So those are the next steps for the working group. And I think that's the end of our slides. Yes, that's the end of our slides. Thank you, Sarah. So high-level summary, we have an interest group that's trying to look across the common space as a whole, that's developed that hexagon diagram, and the working group is trying to extract from a series of case studies what are the common implementation patterns, so that we can try and pull them together into a document that says, if you're going to build a commons, these are the kinds of functions you should think about.
Yeah. So we have 15 minutes left, and what we wanted to do is open it up to kind of questions and also some discussion, see your reflections on the commons, if you're working in one of these initiatives, or maybe when we did the Mentimeter at the start, for some people this was a new area. It might be that you're working at an institutional level, or, you know, we're open to whatever questions you have arising out of this work. So if anyone wants to raise a hand or put something in chat, or if the people who are in the room in Seoul, we have roving microphones there. So by all means, raise a hand and we can bring your questions in. And you don't all need to rush to be the first. Hopefully we've not totally confused you. I see various names have been put in the attendees. Would encourage you to join the kind of working group and interest group. We're obviously looking for like other speakers in the series. So if you know people working in this space, you know, by all means, encourage them to contribute to that. There's a comment from Rebecca. This is a very informative session, but she's a newbie working very much on input mode. I think a lot of the RDA sessions you go to learn, and you know, that's totally legitimate. You don't have to have things to contribute or presentations to give or reflections. So don't worry if you don't have questions. There's lots of sessions I go to around more of the technical aspects where I'm just learning as well, because I'm much more on the policy side. So no questions there. Does anyone else either want to offer an observation, or so Volmar, you've raised a hand.
Yeah, so maybe just an observation to break the silence a bit, and hopefully someone will follow. I mean, I just wanted to say that as someone working at, for example, NAIC in their projects and in Elixir, which seems to do similar things, but I'm not really sure it would be defined as a commons. And also the RDA Life Sciences Data Infrastructures Interest Group, which was introduced or advertised for the first time at the plenary today. I mean, I think it would be very interesting to find some common grounds and I mean, conceptualize the conceptualization that you showed during your presentation, Sarah, with the hexagonal patterns there, with the data interoperability in the middle. I think this simplifies discussions, and even though it might not be a perfect model, it's still very nice to start to explore the area.
Yeah, no, I would certainly describe Elixir as a commons. I think, you know, it's trying to bring things together in that life science space. And if somebody from Elixir would like to speak in the speaker series, we'd be very happy to hear from you. One of the things we're trying to do through that speaker series is really to test the model. So do we find that there are elements that are missing, you know, for certain domains or for certain geographic spaces? So that's a good way to help refine it. And as you say, like, there's so many things that are kind of coming together. So we've got that life science initiative, which is also kind of linking into the EOSC work, the European Open Science Cloud. And I think one of the challenges we faced within our interest group and working group is that we're really addressing everything. It's like the mother of all interest groups, because the Global Open Research Commons is like kind of like the highest level. It's like everything related to RDA, because it's addressing the persistent identifiers, it's addressing the metadata schema, you know, data discovery, it's addressing all of the aspects around storage, all of the aspects around training and human capacity. So we found it quite hard to have a kind of tight enough scope or concrete enough outputs that can make it useful, because it's linked into essentially every working group and interest group. And one thing, this is why we have an interest group as well as the working groups, because the interest group is really like that placeholder for discussion. And then we've tried to, with this first working group that Karen Payne is leading, we're trying to then, you know, describe the different commons initiatives and trying to get that kind of model and terminology working well. But as we move to the phase of saying, okay, so we have this model for the commons, how are we implementing each element?
Yeah.
Essentially, a lot of that work's already done in the different RDA working groups, you know, because they're addressing the fine level of how you're setting up your national PID strategy, how you're ensuring that your data citation works, and they're all interconnected. So I think that's one of the challenges for this group, that it's so kind of, such a big remit, that to try and help make the discussion useful, it can be difficult. But maybe you want to reflect on that too, Andrew? Or...
yeah, and then I'll come to Kirsten. So yes, I agree with all of that. I think one of the nice things for me coming out of this particular event is the way that hexagon diagram, we're going to have to come up with a better name for it than that.
The beehive
typology.
diagram.
The beehive, maybe.
Because it's like a beehive.
Yeah, my organization already has a sub brand, which is a whole lot of hexagons, so I probably don't want to go there. So that diagram is proving useful as a way of enabling people to talk about the same thing, if you like, from their different perspectives. So the data spaces people found it useful, the data principles people found it useful. And it's not just data. I mean, one of the hexagons is tools and services, and so that plays into the work of the Research Software Alliance as well, who are focusing on research software. So it really is trying to be that top level unifying model for everything. But as Sarah quite correctly points out, okay, great, but then you have to build something. And so what is it that you build, and how do you make it hook together? And that, I think, is the the advantage of the working group activity, that hopefully at the end of that, we'll come out with a good description of how you build a commons that fits within that model. Oh, sorry, Kirsten.
I try my image. Okay.
Yeah, no, the image is great. Thank you. Nice to see you again.
Well, no, I could see you. Thank you so much for all your it's for me actually, even though I'm not a newbie at RDA, but just bringing things together from EOSC to ARDC was really, I've never attended one of your sessions. So what I think is that I heard many things that we are all discussing in different levels, at the national, at the institutional level. And I sometimes have the feeling that wheels are reinvented several times. And so it would be so, do you have strategy of really how to connect earlier with, to ensure, for example, that the national research data infrastructure in Germany is not somehow like redoing and doing things differently to what you are doing with EOSC and ARDC, and especially, I think every new colleague I have, I show your ARDC data support pages because they're really amazing, but still people are reinventing them. So I think we could, if we manage to really make connections, we could save a lot of energy and time and just focus more on implementing things.
Yeah, I think you're completely right there, Kirsten. I think one thing that hopefully is a useful outcome from this, because we have that typology diagram, and that is not branded as any commons. It's not the ARDC model, it's not the EOSC model, because it's generic. It kind of tries to draw the common elements from all of these. Hopefully that's something that people can essentially adopt as a model, because I think it's always problematic when you go, well, this is for Australia, there will be something specific about their context. So you can learn lessons from it, but people will never take it as the de facto. So this is why we've tried to look at all these different initiatives to try and pull out the de facto. And I mean, we've got the typology, we've got the start of like a set of definitions. And then we were mentioning before, the next stage is then to look at how do you implement in each of those categories. And I think if we have some kind of overarching how-to guide, or, you know, a beginner's guide for people who are setting up national infrastructure like NFDI, I mean, lots have already been set up, so we're kind of a little bit behind the curve. But I think if we have something that people can be pointed at as like an RDA guide, I think that would be very useful. One thing to note, there is actually funding kind of coming out. There's already funding through EOSC Future for different things like domain ambassadors, and for people to take RDA outputs and use them in EOSC working groups, or use them in groups to try and push RDA work into EOSC. But there is a call that RDA has submitted an application to, and that's specifically aiming to help working groups advance their work. And we discussed with Ari and Najla about potentially having, you know, like a consultant working with us to help with, you know, essentially formalizing all the documentation. So, I mean, if that comes off, that will also help us advance that work, and hopefully have a more kind of professional, you know, much kind of richer content at the end, because when you're doing things on volunteer effort, it's always quite slow to progress things. And I think, yeah, hopefully some kind of like overarching model definitions and kind of basic guidance can hopefully help avoid reinventing wheels. But do you want to come back on that, Kirsten?
Yes, just a little addition, because of course we all know about EOSC. It's like this big thingy on at the end, you know. And then we do have people in Germany, for example, from KIT, who are like ambassadors to EOSC. But I think, because especially what you explained here, that the strategies of how to also acknowledge and include domain recommendations, there are many, and all the other things, you should possibly think about more outreach and just go to conferences and present it all over the place. And then people, because it's often not the same people, like now we at RDA, but those people who are now building any national research data infrastructure, like we have this NFDI for Earth consortium, I think very few are at RDA. So we need to possibly, it would be definitely helpful to spread out a little more and bring your message, because you're doing great stuff.
I think that's a very good point, actually. We probably should have a targeted advocacy campaign as part of like our adoptions and output. So like you say, you know, York, who's the head of the NFDI, he certainly comes to some EOSC meetings, but he probably doesn't come to RDA. So we should maybe have like a campaign where we reach out to these people proactively and we say, do you know about this model? How could it be useful for NFDI? Or start to attend conferences where we specifically promote the RDA outputs, because you know, we're all working for our own organizations, and when we go to conferences, I'm speaking about EOSC or GEON, Andrew's speaking about ARDC, but I think actually the RDA model that we're developing here is much more useful because it's something other people can tangibly take and use and adopt. So yeah, I think that actually is something we should reflect on, and if we get that EC funding, that's probably something we should write into our activity plan. I see there's a question from Yasuhiro. I missed some parts of the presentation, but may I ask what the WDS logo represents or suggests? So Karen Payne is the chair of the working group that's linked to the interest group that Andrew and I
one of the co-chairs.
Co-chairs of. Sorry?
Yeah. One of the co-chairs. I'm also a co-chair.
One of the co-chairs. Yeah, there's several co-chairs on both the interest group and working group. And Karen's the one who's actually put all the slides together for us and done all the work to coordinate us and get us ready for the plenary. So this is why it's got a WDS logo, but the work isn't limited to WDS. It's just that Karen's been the one who's kind of been our savior and got everything ready.
Yeah, huge thanks to Karen for that. Just adding to what Sarah was saying there, and responding to your question, Kirsten, I mean, yes, you're right. There's a lot of wheel reinvention going on. And I agree that we need to do more on advocacy to make people aware of the work we're doing. And we should absolutely build that into our work plan. But I think I haven't got this very clear in my head at the moment, so it's probably going to sound muddled. I think before you can talk to people about avoiding wheel reinvention, you need to make sure that you're all talking about the same thing. And so that for me was the takeaway out of the two BOFs that I attended already at this event, that there are a lot of people who are actually talking about very similar things, but using different words. And so I think the starting point for us would be, here's our typology, here's the hexagons, here are the definitions. So this is what we mean by each of those terms. And these are the things that we think you need to include in a commons. Oh, and here are some examples of specific domain solutions or specific national solutions that we've mapped onto those terms so you can see how they work. So I think it seems like a cop-out, but I think soon, like this year, we'll have a much better package to share with people. Now, you're right, and Karen's right, and Sarah's right, that we're working in an area where everything is changing around us all the time. New things are being put in place and built up. But there's still lots of things that have not yet started. And there, I think we have an opportunity to present a way of thinking about the space that might help people. Oh, and thank you for your nice words about the ARDC web pages. I'll pass them on to my colleagues.
Yeah, please do so, Andrew. It's really great. But you know, we have in Germany, sorry if I just interrupt, but we have this now a lot of money to deal with metadata, and they start like making a list of repositories. So I just say, why don't you go to re3data or Flash?
Yes, of course.
And then they just, but they have to define everything, and this is wasting so much time instead of just really being more open.
Yeah, some of it, I describe this to my colleagues as the blank whiteboard problem. You know, everyone who comes into a space says, look, everything that everyone has ever done before is rubbish. I'm going to start with a blank whiteboard and do it properly. Yeah, that just takes a long time.
Yeah, and I think where we do have resources like re3data, you can just point to it. There's no need to, you know, have a new list of repositories. And if needed, you could, I mean, they have the API, so you can define your own interface onto it with, you know, whatever kind of filters so that it's specific to the approved repositories by your particular funder or institution, or only the certified repositories or whatever else. So I think we should be reusing these kind of global and generic resources a lot more, because it saves us all having to update the data that's underlying it, which is the big sustainability problem. So yeah, these kind of resources like re3 data or fair sharing or the RDA disciplinary metadata catalog should be the kind of common resources that we all use as our kind of reference points.
Yep.
Sorry to
We should
interrupt,
probably
but
wrap things up.
yes, it's
Sorry.
3:30, so it's better to wrap things up now.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
great.
we've come to the end of the 90 minutes. So a huge thank you to all of you for attending. Hopefully you've got some useful links and references. I see many of you have put your names in the Google Doc, so I'd encourage you to join the interest group and working group. As Andrew showed, there are a whole series of talks coming up over the coming months where you can hear about specific commons, or also our kind of like wrap up of those and the next plans from this plenary session and the discussions we've had here with the different BOFs. But yeah, there's a lot of work in this space, and I think a lot of it's now starting to consolidate. So there should hopefully be kind of more useful resources for you to build on. So thanks all of you. Thanks to Andrew for his inputs as well, and enjoy the rest of the plenary. Thank
Bye all.
you. Bye-bye.